Good morning and thank you for joining us today as we take a look at the Register of Persons Holding a Controlled Interest in Land, or RCI for short. In particular, we're focusing on guidance for trusts today. Today we'll be focusing on guidance for trusts when considering a submission to RCI. However, we do also want to briefly introduce you to the background and purpose of RCI, including Registers of Scotland's role. We also want to introduce you to the language of RCI and subsequently whether or not you are in scope of it. We'll also go into some detail on what we mean by trusts and trustees and where the regulations will apply. After that, we'll take a high-level look at what information you'll need to provide, the duties associated with RCI, how RCI is an event-driven register, and then finally we'll look at our essential reading. So let's get started and take a look at the background and purpose of RCI. Although many of you know us already, we'll take a quick look at who Registers of Scotland are. Then we'll take a look at the RCI timelines and go through an overview of RCI as a whole before deep diving into trusts. At Registers of Scotland, we hold and maintain 21 public registers, including the Land Register, General Register of Saisines and the Books of Council and Session. We are a non-ministerial office of the Scottish Government and the Keeper of the Registers of Scotland is directly accountable to Scottish Parliament. At ROS, we design and build digital services to enable our customers and the public to access the registers we hold. If you know us, you'll be aware of some of our key projects here, including ScotList and the Digital Submission Service, all designed to make interacting with ROS easier for our customers. Now let's take a look at how RCI came about. The Land Reform Scotland Act 2016 gave regulation-making power to Scottish ministers to provide for the disclosure and publication of information about controlling interests in landowners and tenants across Scotland in a new public register. In conjunction with other transparency regimes, the regulations are intended to ensure there can no longer be categories of owner or tenant where, intentionally or otherwise, control of decision-making is obscured. The register commenced on the 1st of April 2022, originally with a one-year transitional period on the 1st of April 2023. Scottish Parliament have since approved an extension to the time period for compliance for RCI submissions by a period of 12 months. Offence provisions will now take effect after 1st April 2024. Scottish ministers do encourage everyone who is eligible to engage with the process as early as possible and give themselves plenty of time to register before the new deadline. It is free to submit to and search the register. So what is RCI about? Firstly, it is essential to point out that RCI is not a register of land. It is, as the full name says, a register of persons. This register will make it easier for anyone, whether that be an individual, community body or other party, to find out who has control over the decision-making process in relation to land and property in cases where it is not publicly transparent elsewhere. This means that it will be possible to look behind every category of entity in Scotland, including overseas entities, partnerships and trusts, to see who controls land. The regulations place a responsibility on owners and tenants to supply information to RCI of their controlling interest. After the grace period for registration, penalties will become applicable for failure to register. To better understand how a trust may be in scope, it's important to understand the language used within RCI. This will better help you frame and understand your own situation. In RCI, we have two parties, the recorded person and the associate. The recorded person is the owner or tenant, and this is classified here as a registered or recorded long lease of more than 20 years of land in Scotland. And the definition of land does include buildings and other structures. Then we have the associate. This is the person who has significant influence or a controlling interest in the land owned or tenanted by the recorded person. I'll explain this in more detail shortly. By the end of the presentation, we will have covered the following key stages. Do I need to register? What do I need to make an entry? What do I need to prepare? How do I make an entry? What do I do after submitting? We'll understand the 30-day period, and we'll understand about maintenance and updates. Now let us look at who will need to register. Before we delve any further into RCI itself, it's first worth considering the most obvious reason that you or your client may be out of scope of RCI. You will automatically be out of scope of RCI if you are already subject to another UK transparency regime that is listed in Schedule 2 of the regulations. We've covered this extensively on our RCI knowledge base and in our beginner's guide to RCI video, which you can find on our YouTube channel. So I won't go into significant detail today, but you'll see further examples on the slide. In understanding whether or not you need to register, it's important to consider the following. For example, if you are the named owner on the title, whether that be on Land Register or one of the SASIN's registers, or similarly, if you tenant land that is registered in the Land Register or recorded in one of the SASIN's registers. Again, by tenancy here, we mean longer than 20 years. In either of those scenarios, if there is a person not named on the title, but who has controlling interest on the land, which I'll come to, then the owner, tenant, will be the recorded person, and the person with controlling interest will be the associate. A third scenario I should mention, and this is particularly relevant to trusts, is that it may be the case that existing owners or tenants are no longer associated with the land. There will be cases where the land is held by trustees, and where due to the passage of time, the Land Register or Register of SASINs lists persons as owners or tenants who no longer have any legal connection with the property. The most likely example of this situation is where all the trustees have resigned or are deceased. Although they still appear in the Land Register or Register of SASINs, they have no legal connection with the trust. For example, you may have a property that was purchased back in 1918, but all of the original trustees who were named on the title are now deceased. In this instance, the current trustees are to be treated as the owners or tenants. The duty to register falls on the current trustees. This scenario would fall into Regulation 23A. I will cover this in a little more detail in this presentation, but it's important to note that we have guidance on Regulation 23A, including a video, within our knowledge base guidance. I said I would come back to the definition of controlling interest to help you decide whether you have or indeed are an associate. This is a key consideration in understanding whether or not you or your client needs to consider registration in the RCI. People with a controlling interest in land can influence high-level decisions made about the land, such as in relation to the disposal, leasing, or changing the use of land. It is about key decisions in relation to land, not the everyday decisions about, for example, what paint colours might be used or which bulbs ought to be planted. As mentioned, in RCI, the person who has significant influence or control over these decisions is known as an associate. That completes the RCI overview, but as I said, today we're going to focus on trusts and how they're affected by RCI. Many of you watching will already be familiar with the purpose of trusts, but for those who are less familiar, a quick summary. A trust provides a means where one person or group can manage the property of another. They're usually set up to confirm holding of land for a purpose, for example, in the form of family or pension trusts, commercial trusts, or charities. The land is held for a defined shared purpose and generally intended to benefit the beneficiaries. Most trusts have a truster, those who set up the trust with the assets, trustees, those who become the legal owners of the assets, and they must act in the interest of the beneficiaries. Then you have the beneficiaries, those who benefit from the trust, for example, family members or local communities. The Land Register can display trusts under individual names or as trustees of. Generally speaking, trusts information tends not to be updated on the Land Register or Register of SASINs frequently. It is also worth mentioning that if trustees hold their position ex officio on a Land Register title, they can apply for rectification to update the title to show the current trustees and therefore would not be required to submit to RCI if the current trustees were the only persons with significant influence or control. For the purposes of RCI, trusts are required to register if there is a person with controlling interest, again, this is known as the associate, who, for example, is a trustee not listed on the Land Register or SASINs, or has significant influence over an entity which is a trustee for the recorded person, or has the right to exercise influence or control over the trust or recorded person. When it comes to trusts, a person with significant influence or control is one who can appoint or remove trustees other than by application to the court, can make decisions over assets or direct investments, can amend the trust deed, can revoke the trust, and this may include sole beneficiaries who are of age, and or can influence or control without holding a formal position. It is also important to note, though, that there are exceptions. This would include anyone on the payroll, a creditor or judiciary member managing related proceedings, and or a statutory body performing a related function. Beneficiaries can also be an exception. This is because a purely financial interest does not equate to engagement in the governance of a landowning body or entity. Where the beneficiaries are engaged in the control or governance of the trust, then it is expected that they would be registered as associates on that basis. As I mentioned, I won't go into significant detail on Regulation 23A today, but in the scenario where all trustees listed on the land register or SAZENS are no longer involved in the trust, then all the current trustees or office bearers would need to register an RCI. Each of those would be registered as both a recorded person and an associate. To be clear, they register themselves first as a recorded person, and then they add themselves as the first associate, and then add all the other associates. This will only be applicable where all trustees or office bearers no longer have any connection with the land. If one or more is still involved, your trust will not fall into this regulation. It can also apply where ex officio office bearers are not listed, only their office is named. It must be made clear in the submission to the RCI that an entry is being made on this basis, and there is a question on this during the submission process. For detailed online support, I'd again point you towards our beginner's guide video online, but there are a few things I would like to pull out today that we think would be very helpful. Firstly, we have 4 demo videos on how to submit as a trust on our website. This includes how to set up an account and what type of account you should use. This, along with our guidance, is a very helpful demonstration to use alongside your first submission. Secondly, we have our online support tool. This can be used to help you self-determine if you or your client are likely in scope of RCI as a recorded person. This tool can give you an indication as to whether or not you likely need to create an entry. Whilst using the tool, you'll be prompted to answer a series of questions based on yours or your client's circumstances. Once you've completed the questions, you'll be provided with results that indicate whether you likely need to make an entry. Please be aware the results will be dependent on the accuracy of the answers provided and that the final decision should be made by you. This is only to provide some assistance. Now we're going to look at some example scenarios for trusts. For example 1, we've got the Bloomfield Trust. Anne and John are the current trustees and are named owners on the land register. Paul is a new trustee. He is not on the land register. He has equal powers on the land owned by the trust as Anne and John. In this example, Anne and John will each need to register as recorded persons, and both Anne and John will also need to register Paul as an associate. When the first submission is made, Paul will be allocated an associate reference number, or ARN, which must be used by Paul in future submissions. For our second scenario, we have the Paddington Trust. Here we have Nima and Charlie. They are the current trustees and they are on the land register. A third party, Ray, can appoint and remove trustees. He is not named on the land register. Similar to the previous one, Nima and Charlie will need to separately register as recorded persons. Both Nima and Charlie will need to register Ray as an associate and reuse his ARN as above. Let's move on to the McNeil Family Trust. This scenario is a bit more tricky. Alan and Joan were trustees of the McNeil Family Trust and are named as owners on the land register, but left the trust years ago and the land register title was not updated. Phil and Nicola are trustees now. In this case, we refer to Regulation 23A, which we presented on earlier. They are to be treated as owners. Phil and Nicola are in scope of RCI as all original trustees have ceased to exist. To go into a bit more detail, both Phil and Nicola are treated as owners as there are no original trustees. Phil and Nicola will need to separately register as recorded persons. Because they're not on the land register title, they're also associates. Both Phil and Nicola will each need to register themselves and one another as associates. To be clear, when Nicola registers as a recorded person, she will add herself and then Phil as associates. When Phil registers as a recorded person, he will add himself and then Nicola as associates. The next scenario will look at companies as trustees rather than individuals. Yellow Company and Green Company are both UK limited companies and are trustees of the Colour Wheel Trust. As they are already reporting into a UK transparency regime, there is no need to register on RCI. There are further examples on our guidance articles. There are also some excellent examples in the Scottish Property Professional Support Lawyers Group article published in the April 2022 edition of the Law Society Journal. These include examples on SIPP purchases and overseas trusts. The link is on the screen. If you have decided that the trust is in scope, it's important that certain duties are met. We cover these in more detail in guidance and videos I've mentioned before. For recorded persons, if they are in scope, they must register. They also must verify all the associate detail, provide all the details, and notify the associate that the submission has or will be made. Associates will need to confirm that they are an associate, verify the details when requested by the recorded person, and provide updated details when it's necessary. We'll just take a broad look at the submission steps here. We recommend you have all the information ready. Firstly, pre-submission checks, including the associate verification notice, which I'll come to. Then the entry is created. Once created, the recorded person should download the associate notifications and share them with the associates. Then maintenance. Changes and updates should be made whenever necessary. For example, where there are changes to the trustees, RCI will need to be updated. Also, if any details change, such as an associate's address, RCI will need to be updated. When you come to create your entry, the RCI service breaks the journey down into 4 main sections. These include providing details on the recorded person, whether they be an individual or an organisation, including full name, trust name, and contact address. The recorded person as an individual is the trustee or office bearer, and it cannot be the name of the trust itself. Then there's the land, whether it be on the land register or one of the SASIN's registers. Then the ownership, and this is the capacity in which the recorded person owns or tenants the land. And finally, the associate details, including, if they're an individual, their full name, their date of birth, although please note we don't publish this externally, it's just for identification purposes, their contact address, which can be the registered office, and the name of the trust is optional for associates. If an associate has previously been added to the register, their associate reference number must also be provided. This is a requirement of RCI. An associate must be notified that a submission will be made in their name prior to creating an entry. All of the information required for this can be found within our knowledge base article on information needed to make an RCI entry. As part of our essential guidance, you will find information on the associate verification notice. You'll find a template document on our website. This isn't compulsory, but we thought you might find it helpful. After submission, this screen gives you the option to download the associate notifications, which will look much like this. It is the duty of the recorded person or the online services user who is acting on their behalf to maintain the entry. This is done through Manage an Entry on the RCI homepage. This includes removing associates, changing any information supplied if it has changed, for example, change of address, and if the recorded person ceases to be the recorded person, the entry must be removed. This should be done within 60 days of the change, or in certain circumstances outlined in detail in Regulation 12, as soon as reasonably practicable. Other instances where you may need to amend include if the trust has bought new land, if new trustees are appointed, recorded persons or associate detail changes, or removal of the entry, i.e. if the land has been sold or there are no longer any associates. We know there is a lot to take in around the regulations of the RCI, and we've written and we update when necessary some key essential reading for guidance. These will support you in understanding RCI, whether you're in scope and the subsequent considerations if you are. We strongly recommend you read these as they will support you in creating entries. We've shared links throughout the presentation, but you'll also find these in the search bar on our website. We've provided feedback links on all of our essential reading pages. These can be found on the bottom of each page. You have the option to provide feedback as to whether you found the page helpful, and you can answer yes, no, or yes, but. For all three options, you can provide additional comments. However, when selecting no or yes, but, you can select a reason from a drop-down. We would very much encourage and welcome feedback as we continue to review and update our guidance to ensure we're providing improved support for all. We'll now recap on the webinar. Firstly, we ran through the timeline of RCI and then more about the register itself and why it's been introduced. We explained what is meant when the guidance refers to trusts and trustees. We then introduced you to the language and terminology of RCI, familiarising you with what we mean by recorded person, associates, land, and controlling interest. We also looked at typical RCI scenarios where applicable to trusts, then touched on some of the duties bestowed upon the recorded person and the associate, before finally looking at our guidance, where we provide essential reading and trust scenarios that we hope will help you with your submission. I would encourage you to keep a regular check on our What's New page in the service, as it will inform you of the latest enhancements to the RCI service, such as the new copy function, as well as on duplicate associates and combined notifications, amongst others. Finally, here are some key links and contact details. A reminder that you can sign up to live webinars on the ROS events pages.